Now introduce today's speaker. Ashley Burge is a native of Birmingham, Alabama, and her research on race, gender, class, and sexuality in African American literature is greatly influenced by the rich civil rights history of her hometown. She completed her dissertation in 2019 from the University of Alabama on the works of Toni Morrison and several of her contemporaries. Her dissertation establishes a theoretical paradigm that interrogates spaces of resistance for tragic African American literary figures as a means to process trauma. In addition to studying 19th and 20th century African American lit, Dr. Burge has studied the Black aesthetic, Black immigration, and Black foreign policy at the Black Europe Summer School in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Her essays have appeared in the North Carolina Literary Review, the African American Encyclopedia of Culture, and the critical anthology Through Mama's Eyes. Her current research and teaching interests are Black feminism, ecofeminism, hip-hop culture, and Black horror. Her forever muses are Toni Morrison and Beyonce. Let's welcome today's speaker, Dr. Ashley Burge.
Thank you for that great introduction, Kara. So I won't be talking about Beyonce today, but she is my other muse. I didn't know she was going to read the whole thing. Like Kara said, my name is Dr. Ashley Burge, and I'm an assistant professor of African American literature at Augustana College. There we go. Get this. This is my fourth year at the college, and it has truly been a pleasure to serve and learn with great colleagues and students at Augie. So it's been just a pleasure to relocate to the Midwest from Birmingham, Alabama, the deep South, and to come and see what's living is looking like in the Midwest. I do want to thank Kai Swanson, who wasn't able to be with us today, and also Karen Kuykendall for the opportunity to share my work, and also the Rock Island Public Library for offering this space of community engagement and intellectual engagement. So it's a pleasure. And it is a privilege to be a part of this commemoration of 150 years. That is a big deal. And also the oldest library in the state of Illinois. That's a very momentous occasion. So I'm glad to be a part. So let's get to my talk. I asked you to rock with me for about 25 minutes. I do have a full lecture. But my talk is titled Books That Changed Everything, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and Resurrection of Blackness and the Literary Imagination. And I actually want to start with an overview of my talk. So first, I will give context on Morrison's work and legacy in African American and also American literature. Second, I'll highlight how she challenges the Africanist presence in the American canon. Third, I will discuss how she uses Black female protagonists to reclaim and redefine Black womanhood, which is a focal point of my research, scholarship, and teaching. Finally, I will discuss how I'm currently using her masterpiece, Beloved, to expand African American discourse. And this is the foundation for my book. I started it in my PhD program at the University of Alabama, and now I'm transforming it into a book. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and just about the impact that Morrison has had on American literature as a whole and African American literature. Toni Morrison has become a monolith in African American and American literature because she has transcended the literary canon by illuminating the humanity of the Black community while redefining Black culture, art, folklore, and vernacular as high art in American literature. While the canon was still dominated by white, cis, heterosexual male ideologies in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Morrison's work as editor at Random House and as burgeoning fiction writer challenged and eventually shattered the narrow confines of the American canon. One of Morrison's primary gifts to American letters is the vivacious, multifaceted, dynamic, and human voice of Black womanhood. As mentor and editor, Morrison nurtured and elevated the voices of Black women writers such as Angela Davis, Toni Cade Bambara, and Alice Walker in popular and academic spaces that would have historically silenced them. Further, in Morrison's own beautifully rendered fiction, she meditates on the trauma, the humor, the scandal, and the resiliency of Black women's interior lives while simultaneously redefining Black womanhood, Black motherhood, Black female sexuality, and Black female subjectivity in the midst of white supremacy and patriarchy. Morrison's work is so distinct and tangible because she pierces the chasm between reader and writer and creates a holistic experience in which readers must grapple with moral quandaries, miscarriages of justice, and communal accountability. Morrison uses works such as The Bluest Eye, Sula, and her Pulitzer Prize-winning masterpiece, Beloved, to indict American systems of oppression, white supremacy, black patriarchy, and unyielding social mores. And her indictments are indiscriminate and far-reaching. As I like to tell my students when we discuss Morrison's indictment of social failings, whether they be dominant society or the black community, in Morrison's book, everybody can get it. And this communal accountability creates spaces for healing and redemption for the black community as a whole, and black women specifically. In these pathways of reclaiming black womanhood and elevating black culture, Morrison pervasively resurrects blackness and literary imagination in ways that reinvigorate the American literary canon and generate infinite possibilities for the reconfiguration of black female identity in literature. So I want to talk a little bit about one of her pivotal works, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. We can see the influence and scope of Morrison's work through her critique of the historically and predominantly white American literary canon. Morrison's transmutation of the canon by way of meditations on black womanhood is a monumental feat when we consider the deeply ingrained biases associated with race, gender, and sexuality in American literature. In her treatise on westernized Eurocentric discourses, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness, and the Literary Imagination, Morrison sheds light on the creation of the Africanist presence in American literature. She says of the Africanist presence, it is a disabling virus within literary discourse in the Eurocentric tradition that American education favors, both a way of talking about and a way of policing matters of class, sexual license, and repression, formations and exercises of power, and meditations on ethics and accountability. She further asserts, through the simplest expedient of demonizing and reifying the range of color on a palette, American Africanism makes it possible to say and not say, to inscribe and erase, to escape and engage, to act out and act on, to historicize and render timeless. Morrison articulates and critiques the myriad ways that language has been used to police and repress black identity as a means to prop up a dominant and oppressive narrative. In these limited and limiting terms, we see the formation of caricatures created to divest black women of power so as to uphold the status quo. These characters are well known. We have the mammy figure, the Jezebel, the welfare queen, the strong matriarch, and my absolute favorite in terms of challenging it, the angry black woman. Patricia Hill Collins rightly calls these caricatures controlling images because they are projected onto black women in order to dominate them and render them powerless against various systems of oppression. On the page, these caricatures may seem harmless and maybe even comical, but in the context of real-world power dynamics that are at play in America's many realms of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, they become tragic and dangerous. Consider the untimely death of Sandra Bland, who was accosted by a Texas police officer and later found suspiciously dead in her jail cell after questioning this officer about her supposed traffic violation. This police officer identified and engaged with Bland as an angry black woman, and his recorded excessive force before Bland's death demonstrates this. In this vein, Morrison's reclamation and reconfiguration of language, identity, race, gender, and black womanhood can be positioned as a form of activism that liberates black women from the confines of power dynamics in American society. Briefly, I wanted to talk about another one of my favorite texts of hers, because Beloved is by far my favorite. But I do want to go a little in depth into how she's reclaiming black womanhood, the black body, and black identity structures, and placing them back in the black community and black women's identity on their own term. One of Morrison's most ambitious and creative reclamations of black womanhood is her portrayal of the unbothered, unapologetically black feminist and fiercely independent titular character Sula in her 1973 novel. In a town known as The Bottom in Medallion, Ohio, Suli quickly realizes that she is neither white nor male. And the consequences of her gendered, racialized status is that freedom and triumph are forbidden to her. So she sets about creating something to be. I position Sula as Morrison's experimental Black female character. The experiment is creating a Black female character who shatters all modes of social propriety and racialized and gendered confines in order to recalibrate the possibilities of Black womanhood. Throughout the text, Sula navigates her life almost effortlessly outside of the confines of social conventions. She engages and seeks freely and indiscriminately with various men, whether they be married, single, Black, white, and after their couplings, she discards of them. Afterwards, she is unfazed about the social repercussions that result from the residence of the bottom. Further, she shuns the burdens associated with marriage and motherhood because they hinder her own independence and development. And she also engages in the ultimate betrayal of her friend Nell and ultimately exhibits no remorse for the dissolution of their sisterhood. As Morrison says of Sula, she lived out her days exploring her own thoughts and emotions, giving them full rein, feeling no obligation to please anybody unless their pleasure pleased her. Early in the text, we are accosted by the ferocity in which Sula engages with the world to protect Black subjectivity and identity. In a pivotal scene, Sula and her best friend Nell, who is also her soulmate of sorts, is taunted by 4 white boys who routinely harass young Black children for sport. Their encounter with Sula from the bottom is not as entertaining as they hoped. As they approach, Morrison writes, Sula squatted down in the dirt and put everything down on the ground, her lunch pail, her reader, her mittens, her slate. Holding the knife in her right hand, she pulled the slate toward her and pressed her left forefinger hard on its edge. Her aim was determined but inaccurate. She slashed off only the tip of her finger. The 4 boys stared open-mouthed at the wound and the scrap of flesh. Sula raised her eyes to them. Her voice was quiet. If I can do that to myself, what you suppose I'll do to you? As you can probably guess, after this incident, Sula and Nell are free from these white teenagers who represent the unbridled authority often given to white males in American society. Morrison's portrayal of bodily agency is telling in this scene. Sula engages in a form of self-sacrifice that preserves her bodily autonomy while also protecting the sisterly bond that will sustain the radical, transformative relationship between her and Nell. In American literature, the Black female body has historically been portrayed as a canvas for racialized articulations of the male gaze. In this instance, Morrison subverts the gaze by subverting power dynamics through Sula's radical bodily activism. In turn, Morrison radically alters perceptions of Black womanhood. Not only does Morrison challenge the mammy figure, the angry Black woman, and the Jezebel character, but she creates a space for a new radical Black womanhood that unsettles our current perceptions of Black women. A Black woman who has sex indiscriminately, is fiercely independent, creates her own pathways to success without the pressure to marry or have children, and is devoted to nurturing her own individualistic endeavors apart from the Black community, rivals numerous social conventions that cross generational, cultural, and racial boundaries. Morrison uses Sula's character to challenge Black respectability politics that oppress Black women, as well as the ever-present remnants of the cult of true womanhood, which represses all women in some form or fashion. The impact of her characterization is so jarring to the residents of the bottom in Ohio that she is cast as a witch and treated as a pariah until her death. The irony of Sula's characterization in the 1970s, when Morrison created her, and in this contemporary era in which we analyze her, is that she would have never been vilified, demonized, and called a witch if she were a man. Morrison directly indicts the bottom in Medallion, Ohio, as a microcosm of society that demonizes Black women for daring to choose themselves instead of being martyrs for the Black community and Black men. Now I want to focus on some things that I'm working on in terms of my particular scholarship. All of Morrison's work, I feel like, is my scholarship. I love her oeuvre, and she's doing amazing things even though she's not with us. She's continuing to give us rich spaces to create more discourse. So I want to talk about the paradigm I'm creating for my upcoming book. Morrison's redefinitions of womanhood have led me to consider the theoretical implications of her fiction, especially as it pertains to her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved. Morrison's oeuvre symbolizes a cornerstone in American literature because it viscerally captures the myriad experiences of Black people in turmoil, celebration, tragedy, and triumph, etc., etc. Ultimately, Morrison's works illuminates Black identity and cultural expression in ways that validate the complexities of Black people and their sometimes tragic realities in various American systems of oppression. There is no work that does this more resonantly than Morrison's neo-slave narrative, Beloved. Morrison has described Beloved as a type of memoriam to the lost souls whose tragic voices were silenced by the inhumanities of the Middle Passage in American slavery. In interviews, she has said, "There is no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presence of or collect the absence of slaves. And because such a place doesn't exist that I know of, the book had to." In that interview, Morrison ruminates on transforming the very landscape of Southern towns such as Charleston or Savannah with a 300-foot tower or a bench by the road to commemorate these tragedies. But even as Morrison laments the collective indifference towards the shame of American slavery, her seminal work, Beloved, transforms and reconfigures the very landscape of African American and American literature by forcing her readers to confront the past and acknowledge its interconnectivity to the current reality of Black experience in America. Morrison does this by positioning Beloved as a work of narrative revisionist history that challenges the westernized Eurocentric confines of the tragic mode as a means to reclaim Black identity and subjectivity. I position these maneuvers as fundamental constructs that imbue a literary aesthetic that is rich for interpreting African American works. In Beloved, Morrison executes a literary aesthetic that is applicable to various works of African American literature that interrogate tragedy as an inevitable consequence of Black oppression and disenfranchisement. And here are just a couple of works that I would like you to check out that I'm also using in this particular project. Beloved resonates with the works of Harriet Jacobs' Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl and Susan Laurie Park's Venus, in which women in repressive societies must gain agency through unique alternative forms of power. This agency may be gained through their sexuality, through their roles as women or mothers, or through the tragic acts that liberate them. Several of Morrison's predecessors and contemporaries also interrogate tragic circumstances in order to reveal the inhumanities that African Americans have had to overcome. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God does this by showing the intersections of gender, race, class, and ecology, while Susan Laurie Parks does so by illuminating tragic hope in a dystopian society in Fucking A. The bounds of African American literature are still further expanded by Kyle Baker's graphic novel, Nat Turner, which reimagines the Nat Turner rebellion through visceral images that transcribe the narrative. Further still, Morrison transcends the bounds of Black female identity formations through her portrayal of lawless women in her own work, A Mercy. These works illuminate suffering, mourning, and violence in ways that engender resistance, meaning, healing, and catharsis. I position Morrison's neo-slave narrative as a text that has viable theoretical implications that can be used to mine these tragic works and redefine the classically tragic mode. Ultimately, I resist the notion to demarcate fiction from literary criticism. Instead, literary fiction and theory are contextualized as interdependent, and their union provide a lens that allows a reconfiguration of classical tragedy. The foundation of this strategy echoes the scholarly pursuits of literary critics such as Arlene Kaiser. Kaiser posits, rather than viewing contemporary literary works solely as texts to which established theories can be applied, I can contend that these literary works themselves theorize about the nature and formation of Black subjects under the slave system and in the present by utilizing slave characters and the conditions of slavery as a focal point. Using Beloved as a fictionalized theory, I create a literary paradigm that explores the manifestation of tragedy and redemption in Incidents, Their Eyes, Venus, and Nat Turner. Using this paradigm, I illustrate how the study of tragedy and tragic acts in African American literature is pertinent to fully understanding the foundation of African American literature and its connection to resistance and activism. As Adrienne Poole argues, the recognition that we all share the capacity to suffer, that suffering offers a communality of meaning, constitutes the first step in formulating resistance to oppression and forcing political change. Beloved is an ideal narrative for the work because Morrison has included various multifaceted layers throughout the work that reflects these nuances. Morrison also masterfully weaves various constructs of African American and American history, African American and American literature, and other social and cultural constructs to reconcile the chasms of American discourse. Morrison has compared her work to a kind of literary archaeology on the basis of some information and a little bit of guesswork to reconstruct the world that these remains imply. Within this combination of historical and literary insight, I construct a framework that can be used to analyze other African American tragic works. I call this framework the tragic mercy. Morrison's reconceptualization of classical tragic modes transforms Beloved into a Morrisonian tragedy, imbued with wholly Black cultural aesthetics that humanize Black characters, while creating pathways that engender political change, individual and community rebirth and healing, and reanimation of Black selfhood. This project conceptualizes Morrisonian tragedy through the tragic mercy paradigm, which illustrates the transmutation of these acts. The tragic mercy paradigm consists of four major components that illuminate the duality of tragic acts in American literature. These components include catalytic activism, self-reclamation, sabotaging tyrannies, and rewriting fatal communal structures. Though there are a plethora of acts in African American literature that may align with the tragic mercy paradigm, I posit that redemptive tragic acts, or tragic mercies, fully define Morrison's strategy to provide solace to the pervasive traumas that continue to haunt the Black community. The primary tragic mercy used to build this framework is Morrison's portrayal of Setha's infanticide in Beloved. Morrison's manipulation of the tragic act and its subsequent impact both reify the valuation of the Black aesthetic while resisting detrimental ideologies of traditional American discourse. Instead of serving as a plot device that singly defines the character's flaws as a communal directive to maintain the status quo, as is the case in classical tragedy, Morrison uses the tragic act to reclaim Black identity and subjectivity. While denouncing tyrannical systems that manifest themselves physically, emotionally, and psychologically on the enslaved subject, it may seem that this aesthetic is an ironic manipulation of the standard tropes of tragedy. However, Morrison grounds the strategy in the Black tradition of signifying. Though Morrison uses many maneuvers to distinguish her work in the American literary canon, signifying untraditional tropes is one of the prominent strategies that allows her to transcend traditional frameworks of American discourse and anchor her text in a vernacular tradition that invigorates the portrayal of tragedy. Henry Louis Gates argues that signifying is the Black trope of tropes, of he who dwells at the margins of discourse, ever punning, ever troping, ever embodying the ambiguities of language, is our trope for repetition and revision, repeating and reversing simultaneously as he does in one deft cursive act. I argue that Morrison signifies on westernized tropes of tragedy in order to center the Black voice and reconcile Black identity formations. Each component of the paradigm works to transcend the tragic mode in order to process the trauma associated with various forms of enslavement. What makes Morrison's rendition of the neo-slave narrative key to this analysis is her emphasis on multivocal, multi-layered, multifaceted Black identities, which yield to a more defined Black subjectivity in the text. Her complex rendering of Black identity allows for marginalized voices, such as those connected to Black womanhood and Black motherhood, to be acknowledged and validated. Further, Morrison positions her revisionist text as a tool to dismantle dehumanizing identities about race, class, and gender. Morrison fits within Elizabeth Ann Ballew's purview of Black women writers who explore slavery through the lens of gender, both to interrogate the myth that enslaved women denied the privilege of having gender identity by the institution of slavery were in fact genderless, and to celebrate the acts of resistance that enable enslaved women to mother in the fullest sense of the term. This analysis is specifically concerned with examining the ways that Morrison illuminates the complexity of Black humanity through resistance. Morrison focuses Beloved on the traumatic journey of Setha Suggs, a woman fragmented both emotionally and physically by the remnants of enslavement. In standard Morrisonian form, the work begins in medias res at 124 Bluestone Road in Cincinnati, Ohio. Setha's home is more of a character in the work than an arbitrary space, because the ghost of her dead child haunts 124 and stirs up painful memories that evoke the traumas of her former enslavement. Though the baby ghost is defined as venomous and spiteful, Setha and her daughter Denver stay and endure its wrath, while all others have deserted them, including Setha's 2 sons, who left in the night, and her mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, who willed herself to death. Setha's existence in Ohio is defined by her past. The future to Setha was a matter of keeping the past at bay. However, some semblance of a future begins to materialize when an old friend, Paul D., arrives and begins to arouse memories from their time at Sweet Home Plantation. Sweet Home's identity in their collective history is as ambiguous as its name. Though both of them were enslaved, they had a form of independence and stability that was unfathomable on other plantations. Enslaved men could carry guns, enslaved women could get married, and the slaveholder, Mr. Garner, provided an idyllic environment that somewhat blurred the lines between enslavement and freedom. These are things that Paul D. and Setha reminisce about as they purposely evade the more horrific episodes of their past. Paul D. acts as a catalyst to loosen Setha's resolve about the past, but his more definitive action is his exorcism of the baby ghost. As he revels in Setha's presence, his contentment is interrupted when he enters the doorway at 124 and walks straight into a pool of red and undulating light that locked him where he stood. It fills him with grief so visceral that he wants to cry. Paul D. is incredulous that Setha and Denver have abided the spiteful ghost for this long. And when it quakes, shifts, and trembles in his presence, he demands, "God damn it! Hush up! Leave the place alone! Get the hell out!" Morrison uses this interchange to foreshadow the tumultuous impact that Beloved will have on Paul D. and the torturous existence that Setha and Denver have endured for more than 18 years. She also uses the grief-inducing, spiteful presence of the ghost to reveal the cause of its distress. What Paul D. and the audience will later learn is that the rage, the grief, and the volatility of this baby ghost is fueled by vengeance, because she has been killed at the hands of the one individual that is supposed to protect and nurture her mother, Setha. In this scene, Morrison introduces the epitome of the tragic act as she unveils the horrific details that engenders Setha's infanticide. Though Beloved has been exorcised from 124, she is reincarnated in the bodily form of an infantilized 20-year-old woman. Paul D. acts as a type of spark that reveals some of the joys of her past, but Beloved's presence incites the heinous memories of the realities of enslavement and the rough choices that many women and men had to make to survive under the dire conditions that they were forced to endure. Morrison makes the scene concise and to the point. Setha flashes back to her 28-day freedom after escaping from Sweet Home Plantation. She basks in the freedom of her children and her newfound role as mother and protector. However, school teacher, the treacherous slaveholder that replaces the amenable Mr. Garner, approaches 124 to claim her children as his property under the Fugitive Act of 1850. In a fury, Setha runs to the tool shed and Morrison narrates the horrific scene. Inside, 2 boys bled in the sawdust and dirt at the feet of a nigger woman, holding a blood-soaked child to her chest with one hand and an infant by the heels in the other. She did not look at them. She simply swung the baby toward the wall planks, missed, and tried to connect a second time, when out of nowhere, in the ticking time the men spent staring at what there was to stare at, the old nigger boy, still mewing, ran to the door behind them and snatched the baby from the arc of its mother's swing. This scene is gory, gruesome, and tragic, as it should be. but it is also revelatory of the lengths that enslaved people were forced to traverse in order to carve out some semblance of agency and humanity under the tyrannical institution of enslavement. It reflects the option that a mother such as Setha has when there is no option for salvation. Is she to choose to relegate her daughter to death through enslavement or death at her own hands? A form of rescue that can only make sense under an oppressive system of human bondage. And it is this moral ambiguity of this tragic act that continues to fascinate and plague literary scholars as they interpret Beloved. This tragic act is an ideal foundation for the tragic mercy paradigm because it symbolizes a type of tar baby ideation that engulfs the traditional routes of portraying enslavement and oppression and initiates a process of accountability and transformation that is inescapable to the reader. And it is within this beautifully tragic space that I use this paradigm to carve out humanity, healing, and redemption in African American literature. So that is the project that I'm working on right now. But also, I just wanted to end by saying this. Morrison's oeuvre is universal in how she connects with her reader and the humanity and the empathy of her reader, but also it really gives a space to memorialize like the horrors of American slavery. Like even when we talk about her using a ghost as like the key point of this particular book and as the key antagonist, it's this idea that slavery is still haunting American society, and Black people are living in this haunting in similar ways that Setha and her daughter were living in this haunting. And this idea of like transforming tragedy is this idea of through your lived experiences, how are you reclaiming agency in a society that continually tries to make you second-class citizens and continually projects these different identities and ideologies upon you. So I always see Morrison's, though tragic, though she has some traumatic scenes and everything in there, it's always spaces for empowerment and agency for individuals who are going through various forms of oppressions. Thank you for your time. That's my paper.